Louisiana, 1837. Rosewater Hall had always been known for two things: its sugar fields that stretched wider than the horizon, and the strange, quiet cruelty of the Warren family. Behind their white colonnades and marble floors, they hid a secret obsession: bloodlines. Superior blood, stronger stock, improved generations, as they liked to say at their supper table while enslaved men served them. But after the patriarch, Silas Warren, died, the mania only deepened. His eldest son, Caldwell Warren, inherited the estate. A cold-eyed man who believed every life around him, human or animal, could be measured, shaped, and corrected. He kept ledgers of every calf, every mare, every enslaved woman who had borne a child. He tracked bone width, shoulder span, height, temperament. And then came the Warren sisters, 5 of them, 5 strange, pale women with sharp faces and sharper tongues, raised to believe their blood was valuable, yet all 5 unmarried, all 5 aging past Southern expectations, all 5 desperate to produce children to secure their inheritance. But no husband was worthy. So Caldwell made a decision that would ripple through Rosewater Hall like a fever. He would choose one enslaved man, the strongest, the fiercest, the one whose name even overseers didn't dare spit out loud. Rourke, a man carved out of struggle, a man whose scars told whole histories, a man who fought like a storm when threatened, and had once taken down an ox with nothing but his arms. Caldwell called him perfect stock. The sisters called him necessary. And Rourke called them all nothing because the rage inside him had no words left. Thus began the quietest, deadliest rebellion Rosewater Hall would ever birth. One that didn't start with a whip or a scream, but with 5 locked doors and a man who refused to be broken. The night Caldwell Warren made his announcement, the lantern light in the great hall flickered like it knew something wicked had been spoken into the air. Rourke stood chained at the wrists, his broad shoulders filling nearly the whole doorway where 2 overseers had dragged him. His expression was carved from stone, still, unreadable, dangerous. Caldwell leaned back in their father's old armchair, legs crossed, ledger open on his lap. He tapped his pencil once as if assessing livestock. Height, 6'3", he murmured. Muscle density, exceptional. Bone structure, ideal. Temperament, fierce, but controllable. The pencil scratched the page. Rourke did not blink. The 5 sisters sat along the polished mahogany table like pale owls watching a wolf. Their gowns were the color of faded roses, their eyes the color of cold water. The eldest, Henrietta, cleared her throat. He looks frightening. Strength is rarely pretty, Caldwell replied. The youngest, Marianne, tilted her head. Does he understand what he's been chosen for? The room went still. Caldwell smiled a thin, poisonous curve. Oh, he understands enough. Rourke didn't look at Caldwell. He kept his gaze on the crack in the floorboard beneath him, because he had learned as a boy that if you stare directly into the eyes of a man who thinks he owns you, he will try to break you for the sport of it. But he listened. He always listened. Caldwell shut the ledger. Father wasted his years believing blood should stay pure, but he never understood improvement, evolution. He rose from the chair, stepping toward Rourke until they were nearly chest to forehead. I intend to correct his mistake. Henrietta spoke again, her voice small and tight. And if he refuses? The overseers laughed under their breath. Caldwell didn't. He won't refuse, he said quietly. Pain is an excellent persuader. Rourke finally lifted his eyes slowly, deliberately, and locked them on Caldwell's. For a moment, the room felt colder. Caldwell swallowed before speaking again. You are to serve the Warren bloodline, he said. You will enter each of my sister's chambers when instructed. You will produce children, strong children, children fit to inherit Rosewater Hall. Your compliance is not optional. The chains clinked as Rourke slowly straightened his posture. He did not move forward. He did not step back. He only breathed slow, deep, controlled. Take him away, Caldwell ordered. We begin tomorrow night. As the overseers turned him, one of the sisters, Marianne, whispered something that Rourke heard clearly despite the distance. I don't want this, but Caldwell did not care. Rourke was dragged back across the hall, boots scraping the floor. The chains bit into his wrists. The doors closed behind him. The sisters sat in stiff silence. Then Caldwell looked at them and said the words that would ignite the coming storm. "You should be grateful. Men of his strength are a rarity. Think of the children you will bear." Henrietta shivered. Marianne cried softly. Caldwell smiled like a man who had just solved an equation. And deep beneath the house, locked in his cabin, Rourke sat in the dark, not afraid, not defeated, but planning. Because he knew something Caldwell didn't. A man forced into breeding was not a man conquered. He was a man waiting, and the Warren family had just given him 5 reasons to destroy them. The first scream drifted out of the big house long before Elijah reached it. He froze at the edge of the oak-lined path, heart thundering so loud it drowned out the cicadas. The sound wasn't pain, it was anger. A woman's voice, sharp as a cracking branch, shouting his name with the authority of someone who never had to repeat an order. "Elijah!" He swallowed hard. The master's sisters, all 5 of them. Behind him, the slave cabins glowed with firelight and murmurs. Everyone had heard. Everyone knew. Some had even touched his arm before he walked away. Silent prayers disguised as whispers of strength. Others stared with helpless dread because when a white man selected a woman, it was terrible. But when he selected a man for 5 white women, it was something no one had a word for. Elijah stepped forward. Each foot felt heavier, as if the soil itself wanted him to sink and vanish. Halfway to the veranda, he passed the whipping post. He tried not to look, but his eyes flicked up anyway, the stains, the ropes, the scars carved into the wood like ghosts of every back laid against it. His stomach twisted. Whatever waited inside that house would be worse. The front door slammed open, and Lila Beaumont, oldest of the 5 sisters, appeared in the doorway. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She looked furious. "Don't make them call you thrice," she snapped. He reached the steps, bowed his head. "Yes, miss." Behind her, the others gathered in a row like judges. 5 women with 5 expressions. Lila stern, unyielding. Marigold smiling in a way that made his skin crawl. Josephine arms crossed, annoyed at the world. Ruth shaking, but not from fear, from excitement. Clara, the youngest who couldn't meet his eyes. And overhead, on the grand stairway landing, stood the master himself, Cornelius Beaumont, smiling like someone who had just solved a puzzle. "Elijah," he said with casual warmth, as though he were greeting a friend instead of summoning a man for something unspeakable. "I trust you understand the honor you've been given." Honor. The word echoed like a stone dropped into a deep well. Elijah kept his eyes low. I don't understand it all, sir," Cornelius chuckled. "You'll serve this family in a way few men ever will. 5 sisters, 5 bloodlines, and you will improve every one of them." A few of the sisters laughed quietly. One gasped. Clara's lip quivered. Elijah didn't move. Honor. No, this was breeding. This was ownership. This was power carving him like a tool. Cornelius descended the stairs slowly, each step intentional. "When father died, he left nothing but debt," he said. "The Beaumont name lost its shine. Reputation dwindles without heirs, without strong ones." He stopped at the bottom stair. "But you can fix that." Elijah lifted his gaze just enough to see the master's polished boots, the tip of a cane resting near his feet. "And if I refuse?" The sisters sucked in breath. Somewhere, a fireplace crackled louder. The whole house seemed to lean in. Cornelius tilted his head. "Refuse? My boy. Choice is a luxury you never possessed." The cane lifted, its silver tip brushing Elijah's chin, lifting his face. "You will give this family children, healthy ones, strong ones, fierce ones." His smile widened. Born from the fiercest man on this land. Heat surged through Elijah's chest, shame, rage, disbelief, all at war. Cornelius leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper only Elijah could hear. "Consider the alternative." Behind the master, 4 slave catchers lingered in the shadows of the hallway. They were smiling too. Elijah's jaw clenched. He knew what alternative meant. The swamp, the hooks, the bodies no one looked for. He felt the house closing around him like the jaws of something alive. "Miss Lila," the master said, stepping back. "You may begin. He's yours tonight." Lila smoothed her dress, steel in her posture. "Come with me." Elijah didn't move. Not because he refused, though every bone inside him screamed to, but because something else was happening, something none of them noticed. At the top of the stairs, beyond the flickering chandelier light, a shadow shifted. A woman stepped forward, tall, silent. Eyes burning with fury he recognized instantly because it matched his own. A slave woman. Elijah's heart stuttered. Naomi, bound in the house for years. Punished more times than he could count. Cornelius had broken many spirits, but not hers. Tonight, she stood like a storm held together by will alone, her eyes locked with Elijah's. A warning, a promise, a question. He understood all three. Cornelius followed Elijah's gaze, turning halfway. But before he could see her, Naomi stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Elijah exhaled shakily. Lila gripped his arm. "Move," and Elijah did. But now, he wasn't walking into that room alone, because Naomi, quiet, relentless Naomi, was already planning something the Beaumonts would never see coming. And Elijah could feel it. The night of the choice would not end the way they believed. The next morning, Elijah woke to the sound of cicadas screaming through the broken shutters of the old storage cabin. His wrists throbbed from the rope burns, and his back felt stiff from having slept on the floorboards. Yet the real weight pressing on him was the memory 5 pairs of eyes in that candlelit parlor, studying him like he was a bull they planned to breed. He sat up slowly, stretching the ache out of his shoulders. He didn't know which sister would come first, but he knew one of them would. The master had spoken his order with too much pride, too much twisted certainty, for his sisters to dare challenge it. Elijah had seen cruelty before. He had felt it, survived it. But this was a new kind of cage, one made not from iron, but from someone else's expectations. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. He straightened. The latch clicked, and the door opened. Standing there was Maryline, the second eldest, dressed in a pale blue gown that looked like dawn stitched itself into fabric. She wasn't the bold one that was Cassandra. She wasn't the curious one that was Joelle. Maryline had always walked the edges of things, always quiet, always observant, but never harmless. "Elijah," she said softly, as though saying his name itself was a choice she had weighed. He dipped his head. "Ma'am, don't call me that," she murmured. "Not today." He froze. Maryline stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. Sunlight haloed her form, turning her into something almost unreal. She held a small wooden tray, biscuits, a cup of water, a slice of ham. She set it in front of him. "You should eat," she said. "My brother didn't give you supper." "Didn't need none," Elijah replied quietly. Maryline tilted her head. "Even lions eat before they're put to use." His jaw tightened. She knelt down so her eyes aligned with his. "You don't have to be afraid of me." "I ain't," he answered, and he meant it. She wasn't the one he feared. What he feared was becoming whatever the master wanted him to become. Maryline searched his face for what? He couldn't tell. Then, she asked the question he least expected. "Elijah, do you hate us?" It was a dangerous question, a cruel one, even if she did not know it. He didn't answer at first. She watched him patiently, like she truly wanted to hear the truth. So he gave it. "I don't hate you," he said, "but I hate the things y'all do. The things y'all think you got the right to take." We're comment, 2000. Maryline's breath shivered. Not offended, not angry. Something else, something almost ashamed. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "Not any of it. That don't change what it is." Her eyes glistened. She looked away, wiping at her cheek. "You're right." Her voice broke on the edge of it. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and moved toward the door, leaving the food behind. But just before stepping out, she paused. "Elijah, none of us had a choice. Not the way you think." "That's not true," he replied. "Y'all always got a choice." Maryline swallowed hard. "I hope one day you believe that," she whispered. Then she left. Elijah ate slowly. His mind knotted. Maryline was not the sister he had expected to come. He had imagined Cassandra, bold as wildfire, storming in with her chin high and her hands already reaching. Or Joelle, who watched everything with predator-sharp curiosity, or Eleonora, who followed orders like scripture, or Sabine, always smiling like a secret. Marilyn was none of them, and yet she was the first. Hours passed. The sun rose high. Then the door opened again. This time, it was Cassandra, but she wasn't alone. All 5 sisters stood together, blocking the doorway like a jury. Their dresses were different. Their hair was different. Their expressions were different. But every one of them looked at Elijah with the same unspoken awareness. Today was the day the family plan began. Cassandra stepped forward first. "Elijah," she said. "Stand up." He did. "You are going to come with us," she declared. "Our brother thinks this is about breeding, about bloodlines, about strength. But he doesn't understand us half as well as he thinks." Joelle added quietly. "He thinks he's controlling the outcome." Marilyn whispered, "He isn't." Sabine smiled faintly. "Not anymore." Eleonora's voice came last solid as stone. "We will decide how this plays out." Elijah stared at them, confused, wary, coiled like a spring. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The 5 sisters looked at one another. Then Cassandra answered, "Not what our brother wants." A hush fell, a shift in the air, a truth rising from beneath everything Elijah had assumed. "We're not choosing you," Cassandra said. "We're asking you to choose us." Elijah's breath caught, because he suddenly understood. This wasn't the master's plan anymore. This was the sisters' rebellion. And he, whether he wanted it or not, had just become the center of it. The sun rose over the McAllister estate, the heavy light slicing through the morning mist that clung to the cane fields. It glimmered on the copper roof of the main house and cast long shadows across the quarters where the slaves slept, some of them already awake, moving quietly to avoid the overseer's eyes. Yet in the center of it all, one figure moved with a gravity that drew attention without a word. Jeremiah, the man chosen by Master Thomas for his strength and bloodline, now the unwilling pawn in a twisted experiment of lineage and power. The 5 sisters, children of the wealthy McAllister family, still mere girls though groomed as the keepers of the estate's future, stood in the airy parlor, their delicate gowns rustling as they shuffled about. Their eyes were wide with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and resentment. Each of them had been warned by their mother, long since lost to illness, that obedience would secure the estate's legacy, yet none could have foreseen the cruel arrangement their father had etched into the family's story. To them, Jeremiah was both monstrous and magnetic, a man whose power could bend even the most rigid will, yet whose chains marked him as property, as less than human. Jeremiah moved into the parlor slowly, his large frame seeming almost unnatural in the confined space. He carried himself with an awareness that could have been mistaken for pride, if one ignored the subtle tremor that ran through his hands, the only betrayal of the night-long torments endured under whip and lash. The sisters watched him, each imagining the legacy their father had demanded. Some felt revulsion, some excitement, but all understood the unspoken rule: resist and face punishment, comply and live with shame. Master Thomas, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a voice like gravel, appeared at the doorway. His gaze swept the room, lingering on Jeremiah as though weighing him for a measurement that only the mind of a master could conceive. "Remember," he said, each word deliberate, "obedience ensures survival. You are to obey, and your children will carry our name forward. Stray, and the consequences are known." The words were heavy, falling upon the young women like stones. They nodded silently, though inside each heart burned a different flame, some of fear, some of defiance. Jeremiah understood his role, though not the full scope of the horrors that awaited him. Each sister approached in turn, hands trembling slightly, faces pale. The first sister, Emily, stepped forward with a forced smile, her small frame belying the tension in her posture. She extended her hand, but Jeremiah, bound by invisible rules of survival, did not take it. Instead, he lowered his head, letting his presence loom like a shadow over her hesitation. In that moment, something shifted Emily's eyes, filled with a mixture of uncertainty and a trace of rebellious fire, met his, and she understood that her father's plans were more twisted than mere obedience could navigate. The second sister, Anne, followed, her steps cautious. She had grown up with whispers of the estate's cruelty and the punishments for defiance. Her hands shook, and her voice faltered as she spoke, but Jeremiah's calm presence drew from her a reluctant submission. She felt something unexplainable, a spark that made her pulse quicken and her mind race not desire, but recognition that control was a currency far more complicated than the master understood. She realized, with a pang of fear, that the power the master wielded over them was precarious, and that the slave before her held a different sort of strength entirely. By the time the fifth sister, Mary, stepped forward, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the whip's echo in Jeremiah's mind. Each sister had been tested, and each had left with a seed of understanding. Survival required complicity, yet Jeremiah's presence disrupted the equation. He was a living contradiction, both prisoner and force, a man who could not be broken entirely, no matter the whip or the will imposed upon him. As the sisters retreated to the corners of the parlor, Master Thomas's eyes flickered with irritation. He understood only part of what he had created. A web of obedience and desire, of terror and fascination, in which he had no control. Jeremiah, though bound, was already recalculating each glance, each breath, each unspoken word a strategy for endurance, for survival, for eventual resistance. His mind ran through possibilities that no master could conceive. Alliances, subtle manipulations, and the slow accumulation of power in a place that claimed to strip him of it entirely. Outside, the morning heat began to bake the earth. Sweat clung to the slaves in the fields, to the overseers walking the rows, to the walls of the parlor itself. Yet in that room, beneath layers of silk, lace, and expectation, something unspoken hung between the chosen slave and the five sisters. It was neither fear nor attraction, but a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity of the master's design. Each player in this cruel experiment recognized their role, yet none could predict how the narrative would bend beneath the weight of human will. And as the sun climbed higher, casting a harsh light on faces pale with apprehension, the first stirrings of rebellion, cunning, and defiance began to take root, not in the fields, not in the shadows, but here, in the very room where power was meant to dictate life and death. Jeremiah, unbroken in body and spirit, understood that this was only the beginning, and that the bonds of his master's making could, in time, become the chains that bound the master himself. The afternoon sun was a dull blaze over the McAllister estate, throwing long shadows across the worn wooden floors of the parlor. Each crack in the boards seemed to hum with the weight of the day's events, and the air smelled faintly of dust, wax, polish, and fear. Jeremiah, still bound by the chains of ownership but unbound in mind, sat in the corner, his massive frame hunched as though the walls themselves pressed against him. Across the room, the five sisters shifted nervously, their delicate gowns brushing the floor, their fingers entwined in anxious fidgets. Emily, the eldest, had taken it upon herself to observe him with what she insisted was mere curiosity, though in truth her eyes betrayed a flicker of admiration mingled with fear. She leaned against the window frame, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight. Every small movement from Jeremiah, the subtle shift of his head, the tightening of his jaw, the rhythm of his breathing carried meaning. And she understood, almost instinctively, that the master's power could not fully reach him here. Anne, standing by the fireplace, avoided his gaze. Her mind raced with the implications of their father's decree. 5 daughters, 1 man, a cruel experiment in lineage and domination. She clenched her fists, trying to will away the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. Yet something else stirred within her, a curiosity, a recognition of a force she could not name, a power that existed outside her father's reach. Jeremiah's eyes, dark and unwavering, followed each sister in turn. He understood the unspoken rules, approached too openly, and he risked immediate retribution from Master Thomas. Ignore them, and he risked further isolation, the slow poison of neglect that often killed slaves as surely as a whip. And yet, he had learned to navigate these spaces before, to turn fear into observation, to listen to whispered words and catch fleeting expressions. By mid-afternoon, the room's tension had become almost tangible, a living thing that coiled around them all. The sisters, each in their own way, began to exchange glances, subtle nods that spoke volumes without words. Emily's lips pressed together in a thin line. Anne's brow furrowed. Mary, the youngest, dared a fleeting smile, one that Jeremiah noticed immediately. It was a momentary breach of the rigid structure their father had imposed, a recognition that the slave before them was not merely property but a presence that could not be contained. He shifted slightly, leaning against the wall with a slow, deliberate grace. His gaze lingered on Emily, then Anne, then the others, measuring, calculating. It was not desire, not yet it was strategy. He understood that survival required more than endurance. It demanded influence, subtle and unseen. If he could gain even a fraction of control over this forced arrangement, perhaps he could bend the situation to his favor, however slightly. The sisters, sensing the unspoken understanding passing between them, began to relax minutely. Their movements were no longer entirely dictated by fear. Small acts of rebellion appeared in gestures, a hand brushing against the arm of another sister, a quiet clearing of the throat, the exchange of a look that lingered too long. They were beginning to grasp the imbalance of power their father may have decreed, but here in this parlor, another form of influence existed, embodied in the man he had chosen for them. Master Thomas, meanwhile, remained elsewhere, confident in his arrangements and oblivious to the undercurrents of defiance beginning to swirl within the room he thought under control. He could not see the whispered negotiations of glances, the subtle signs of alliances forming, the quiet recognition of strength in the very slave he believed was merely an instrument of his will. As the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped lower, Emily took a bold step. She moved closer to Jeremiah, not touching, but close enough that her presence could not be ignored. She let her voice fall to a whisper, not loud enough for the others to hear. "We do not need to obey him entirely," she said, her words barely audible. "But we must survive. You understand that, do you not?" Jeremiah's eyes met hers, dark and penetrating. A faint smirk touched his lips, a recognition of the fragile, whispered accord being struck. He inclined his head ever so slightly. "I understand," he replied softly, the words almost lost beneath the ticking of the clock and the creak of the floorboards. The other sisters, sensing the shift, drew in closer without speaking. They did not know yet whether they could trust him, nor did they understand the full extent of the danger. But a line had been drawn, subtle and imperceptible, that marked the first moment of mutual acknowledgement. A survival pact formed not from loyalty to their father, but from the shared understanding of power, presence, and human will. The room, once filled with tension and expectation, now carried a different weight, a fragile, almost imperceptible balance that had shifted ever so slightly toward the unknown. Jeremiah remained a slave, yet he was also something more. He was a force that could not be tamed, a quiet storm gathering strength beneath the master's nose, and the sisters, unwitting participants, were already beginning to bend under its pull. Outside, the wind rustled the tall cane, carrying with it a whisper of the chaos yet to come. Within the walls of the parlor, the first threads of resistance, cunning, and subtle manipulation were being woven together, one glance at a time, one whispered word at a time. And in the shadows of the room, Jeremiah sat, poised, patient, and unbroken, waiting for the moment when the balance would tip entirely in his favor. The sun had not yet risen over the McAllister estate, but the parlor was already alive with the sound of creaking floorboards and stifled breaths. Dawn light seeped through the shutters in thin lines, cutting across the room like blades. Jeremiah stood near the fireplace, his silhouette long and dark, watching as the eldest sister, Emily, tiptoed into the room carrying a small bundle of linens. The other sisters followed hesitantly, each step careful, each breath measured. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. The morning ritual of the household, the cleaning, the arranging, the whispering reports to Master Thomas had become a stage for an invisible war. Jeremiah had spent the night observing, memorizing their routines, their hesitations, the subtle ways fear and defiance intertwined. Now, the first reckoning was at hand. Emily placed the linens on a small table, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She dared a glance at Jeremiah, who returned it without expression. The other sisters fidgeted at the edges of the room, their eyes darting from him to each other and back again. They had begun to understand that his presence was no longer a passive one. He had started to exert influence, and with it came a palpable unease. Jeremiah took a slow step forward, his boots creaking softly. "You've been watching me," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent that demanded attention. The sisters stiffened. Emily opened her mouth to deny it, but he shook his head slightly. "No need to speak. I know. Every look, every whisper. I have seen it all." For a moment, silence filled the room like a thick fog. Then Anne, the second eldest, dared to step closer. "And what would you do with this knowledge?" she asked, her voice quivering. The words were measured, but her eyes betrayed both fear and curiosity. Jeremiah's gaze swept over all 5 sisters. "Nothing that will harm you if you respect what is necessary. But understand this, the balance is shifting. Your father thinks he controls the room, controls the arrangements, controls me, but he is blind to the currents under his feet." Mary, the youngest, spoke before the others could restrain her. "Are we to obey him fully, or can we choose?" Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried a weight far beyond her years. Jeremiah stepped closer, and the light from the window caught in his eyes, making them seem like pools of dark fire. "You can choose," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable heavy with promise and warning. "But choosing comes with responsibility. Every decision here has consequences not just for you, but for everyone in this room." The sisters exchanged nervous glances. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. "We understand. But how can we trust you?" A faint smile touched Jeremiah's lips. "Trust is not given lightly. It is earned, step by step, in silence and observation. Tonight, you will see whether my words hold weight. There is a task that must be done, and you will all play a part." The sisters leaned closer, a mix of fear and anticipation coloring their expressions. He had not demanded obedience, yet his presence alone had drawn a line in the sand. The first act of rebellion or of survival was imminent. Hours passed in tense preparation. Jeremiah moved silently, offering subtle guidance to the sisters. A hand on a sleeve here, a whispered correction there. It was not domination, but a teaching of sorts, a preparation for what would come. Each sister began to feel the stirrings of autonomy within her chest, and with it, a fear deeper than anything their father had ever invoked. As dusk fell and the shadows deepened, the household settled into uneasy quiet. Master Thomas would not return for several hours, leaving the sisters and Jeremiah alone. The room, once filled with trepidation, now hummed with anticipation, the energy of an imminent act that could never be undone. Emily turned to him, her eyes wide. "We are ready," she whispered. Her voice carried both challenge and appeal. "Tell us what to do." Jeremiah's gaze swept over all 5 sisters once more. "Listen carefully. Tonight, the first step toward balance begins. No one outside this room must know. One misstep, and everything collapses. But if we succeed—" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We tip the scales forever." The sisters nodded, each in her own way, acknowledging the pact forming between them. Fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming a sharpened awareness, a tool as potent as any whip or chain. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall cane, carrying the scent of humidity and imminent storm. Within the walls of the parlor, the first coordinated act of defiance began to take root, and the balance of power in the McAllister estate shifted imperceptibly, yet irrevocably toward the enslaved man who had long been underestimated. The night was coming, and with it, the first true reckoning for master and daughters alike. Night had fallen over the McAllister estate like a heavy velvet curtain, swallowing the fields and the distant outline of the forest beyond. Inside the main house, candles flickered in iron sconces, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. The air smelled faintly of wax, dust, and the tension that hung so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Jeremiah moved silently through the hallways, his bare feet pressing against the worn floorboards, attuned to every creak, every whisper of the wind through the shutters. The five sisters waited in the parlor, their bodies rigid with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Emily, the eldest, clutched the corner of the tablecloth as if it were a lifeline. Anne and Mary stood behind her, while the youngest two lingered at the doorway, casting nervous glances into the hall. The room was silent except for the occasional drip of water from a loose shutter hinge and the muted rustle of fabric as the sisters adjusted their positions. Jeremiah's eyes scanned the layout. "Tonight," he whispered, "you will move like shadows, unseen, unheard. Your father and the servants are asleep. One wrong sound, one misstep, and the night ends in disaster." His voice carried calm authority, a presence that made their hearts pound in both fear and anticipation. He handed Emily a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Inside this," he explained, "is the first key to shifting the balance. You will place it where he cannot find it. The others will follow the plan precisely. Trust each other, trust yourself, and trust me." The sisters nodded, their faces pale in the candlelight. They had practiced their movements all afternoon under Jeremiah's guidance, but the real test was now. The stakes were higher than any they had imagined. Failure would not just mean punishment, it could mean death or worse, the shattering of the fragile hope they had begun to nurture. Outside, the night was alive. Crickets chirped in rhythm, the wind whispered through the high grass, and the distant hoot of an owl punctuated the darkness. Inside, the sisters began their silent march. Emily led, carrying the bundle, followed closely by Anne and Mary. Each step was calculated, each movement deliberate. The air seemed to hold its breath as they approached the first door of the master's private quarters. Jeremiah's hand brushed Emily's shoulder. "Remember," he murmured, "silence is your ally, fear is your companion. Use them wisely." The door creaked as Emily turned the knob. Her pulse leapt into her throat. Slowly, carefully, she eased it open just wide enough to slip inside. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and the lingering musk of late-night wine. The master's desk lamp had been extinguished, leaving the room in near total darkness. Emily placed the bundle in a drawer she had scouted earlier, a drawer the master never inspected himself. It slid in with a soft whisper against the wood. Outside, Anne and Mary signaled with subtle nods. The younger sisters moved next, arranging the small obstructions and markers Jeremiah had instructed them to place along the hallways, silent alarms that would alert them to any unexpected presence. Each sister performed her task with care, holding her breath, muscles taut with the effort of being both unseen and precise. Jeremiah followed them, a silent shadow at the edges of their world. "You are doing well," he whispered once, though the words were more for himself than for them. Each successful movement was a small victory, a notch in the growing tally of autonomy they were claiming from the hands that had bound them for years. Hours passed like this, the sisters moving from room to room, floor to floor, planting the seeds of subversion with careful, deliberate precision. The house was a labyrinth, but their steps were guided by the hours of observation and instruction. Each sister knew her role, her place, her limit, and yet the weight of what they were doing pressed upon them like a living thing, heavy and urgent. Finally, they reached the attic, the last space on the route they had planned. "Here," Jeremiah paused, speaking softly but firmly. "This is it, the final piece. Place it exactly where I tell you, and tonight will be remembered." Emily stepped forward, her hands steady despite the thrum of her heartbeat. She placed the last piece in the designated corner, and Jeremiah nodded. A wave of relief and triumph washed over the sisters, so subtle yet overwhelming it left them trembling. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from the forest. It whispered through the rafters, as if acknowledging the act that had just unfolded. Inside, the sisters gathered, hearts still racing, faces pale but proud. They had moved through the night like ghosts, invisible and untouchable. Jeremiah finally broke the silence. "You have done well tonight. This is the first night, but not the last. Remember, The balance has shifted, but it is fragile. Every night we act, every choice we make, matters. Protect each other, trust each other, and trust that this house will never be the same again. For a moment, the only sound was their collective breathing, heavy with adrenaline, and the knowledge that they had begun a chain of events that could not be undone. In the shadows, Jeremiah allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The first act of rebellion had been executed. The McAllister estate, for all its grandeur and oppression, had been touched by the hands of those it sought to control. And the night, dark and alive, had witnessed the beginning of a change that would ripple through every corner of the house and beyond. The sisters left the attic quietly, moving back to their rooms, each step measured, each movement deliberate. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in pale hues of orange and pink. Inside, a new awareness had taken root, one of possibility, power, and the fragile, flickering beginnings of freedom. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of the McAllister estate, casting a pale, golden light over the grand parlor. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, wax, polish, and something less tangible, an undercurrent of unease that seemed to have seeped into every corner of the house overnight. Servants moved quietly through the halls, faces downcast, whispers barely audible as they performed their morning chores. Even the rooster seemed hesitant to crow, its call subdued and uncertain. In the master's study, the patriarch of the house, Gerald McAllister, frowned at the growing unease gnawing at him. Something was off, he could feel it in his chest, in the way the silence seemed to press against the walls. The previous night had been ordinary, or so he thought. But the subtle disturbances, the slightly misplaced objects, the faint scratches on the floors had unsettled him. His sharp eyes caught every detail, every imperfection that hinted at interference. Down the hall, Emily and her sisters moved quietly, carrying out their usual morning routines. Their steps were measured, deliberate. There was no hint of fear, only a tense awareness. The success of the night's actions weighed heavily upon them, but also filled them with a quiet pride. They had taken control, even if just for a night, and the sense of power was intoxicating. Anne paused at the foot of the staircase, her gaze lingering on the study door. "Do you think he noticed?" she whispered, voice barely audible. Emily shook her head. "Not yet. But we must be ready for when he does. We cannot falter now." Meanwhile, in the master's study, Gerald rose abruptly from his chair, pacing the room. His hands clenched behind his back, knuckles white, as he tried to reconcile the strange feeling of dread. The family's legacy, the order of the house, the unquestioned control he had always wielded, everything seemed fragile now. He turned to his eldest son, Thomas, who had been trying to keep the household running smoothly in his father's absence. "Something happened last night," Gerald said, his voice low and tense. "I don't know what, but I can feel it. The house, it shifted." Thomas frowned, uncertain. "Shifted, Father? What do you mean?" "I don't know," Gerald admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Objects moved, subtle things, almost imperceptible but enough. Someone has taken liberties they should not have." Downstairs, the sisters exchanged glances, sensing the tension rising in the household. They knew the master would not ignore the disturbances for long. Every decision, every movement, was a step toward confrontation. They had planted the seeds of change, but now they faced the consequences of their rebellion. By mid-morning, Gerald summoned his overseer, a burly man named Colton, who had long been the enforcer of the house's rules. Colton's presence was meant to intimidate, to restore order with brute authority. He entered the parlor with heavy boots, scanning the room with sharp, calculating eyes. "Something's amiss," Gerald said, his tone clipped and commanding. "I want answers. I want to know what was done in this house while I slept." Colton's gaze fell on the sisters, lingering for just a moment longer than comfortable. He knew better than to confront them directly. They were clever, observant, and had grown too confident under Jeremiah's guidance. But still, the scent of unease was strong, and Colton was not a man to ignore such instincts. The sisters remained still, faces composed, but internally their hearts pounded. Every instinct screamed caution. Every memory of the night before reminded them of the risks they had taken, and the possibility of punishment loomed large. Yet, a quiet defiance rested behind their eyes, a message unspoken but unmistakable. They were no longer entirely subject to the control of the house. As Gerald continued his inspection, he found subtle signs of disruption, the slightly displaced objects, faint marks on the floors, and the small, hidden items that the sisters had carefully planted. The realization hit him slowly, like a tide creeping over the sand. They had acted. They had defied him. "Someone in this house is challenging my authority," he growled, voice low but dangerous. "And I will find them. I will know who dared to undermine the McAllister name." The sisters exchanged silent, knowing glances. The reckoning had begun. The delicate balance they had crafted would now be tested against the wrath of a man who believed in absolute control. Outside, Jeremiah observed from the shadows of the oak trees, watching the interactions unfold. He knew the house would never be the same again. The sisters had begun something larger than themselves, something that would ripple through every corner of the estate. And as the day wore on, the first signs of confrontation appeared. Small, deliberate provocations, whispers of suspicion, and subtle defiance that could not be ignored. The sisters had acted, and now, the consequences were inevitable. But they were ready. This day would mark the first true shift in power within the McAllister estate, and none would emerge unchanged. The subtle seeds of rebellion had taken root, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between the old order and the new.